Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel Rubenstein. It's February 23rd, 2025, and this is the live daily briefing of the Israeli Citizen Spokesperson's Office. The humiliating hostage release ceremonies must stop. That's Israel's message to Hamas and to the whole world. As a result of Hamas's repeated violations of the Hamas hostage ransom deal and public ceremonies that humiliate and torture the hostages, Israel has decided to delay the release of hundreds of Palestinian terrorists from Israeli prisons. Terrorists who were supposed to be released as part of Israel's ransom payment to Hamas. Israel said that it will not release additional terrorists until the next release of Israeli hostages is guaranteed and without the humiliation and the torture and the public ceremonies. The people of Israel are fighting savage psychopaths in Gaza who took a mother and her babies hostage, murdered the mother and her babies, demanded a ransom for the return of the bodies of the mother and her babies, and invited the public in Gaza to a parade where coffins of the babies and a woman wrongly identified as the mother were handed over to the Red Cross. It's unbearable. There are 69 hostages who remain in Gaza right now. We need more pressure on Hamas and more pressure on Hamas's patrons, Qatar, Turkey, Iran, and South Africa, until every hostage is home and Hamas is removed from power in Gaza. The Trump administration sees what's happening. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said in a tweet, Hamas's treatment of hostages, including its brutal murder of the Bibas family, further illustrates their savagery and is yet another reason why we are saying these terrorists must release all of the hostages immediately or be destroyed. Remember, Israel is not just fighting Hamas in Gaza. Israel is fighting a 7-front war against the Iranian regime and its proxies in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iraq. You may think that there's a ceasefire in Gaza for now, and that's it, but that's not it. There's a war going on. The IDF carried out strikes this afternoon against Hezbollah rocket launchers in Lebanon. The big news in Lebanon today is that Hezbollah is finally holding a public funeral for its late warlord, Hassan Nasrallah. Yesterday, the IDF conducted a strike on the Syria-Lebanon border where Hezbollah smuggles weapons. Israel continues to carry out major counterterrorism operations in the region of Samaria in the northern West Bank. Israeli troops have been operating in the Palestinian city of Tulkarem, which is next to Israel's coastal plain and just 9 miles to the Mediterranean Sea. Israeli tanks today are operating in the area of Jenin for the first time in 2 decades. Palestinian terrorists are trying to turn the entire West Bank into another Gaza, a base for launching major attacks into the rest of Israel. Israel will do everything possible to stop Judea and Samaria from becoming a Hamas base. We are not going back to an October 6th reality. We are not going back to a reality where terrorist armies that want to destroy Israel are able to mobilize against Israel without a response. Many of the terrorists that Israel is releasing from its prisons in exchange for hostages are being set free in the West Bank. That's not going to make Judea and Samaria any safer for the people living there. Let's take some questions from people who are watching our live stream across the different social media platforms.
Thank you, Daniel. Our first question comes from our Instagram stories. What's your reaction to the funeral of Hassan Nasrallah today in Beirut, with crowds shouting death to Israel and death to America?
I saw a great response to this from Israel's foreign minister, Gideon Sa'ar, who tweeted that the images from Nasrallah's funeral now precisely reflect the historic crossroads where Lebanon stands. The foreign minister of Israel presented Lebanon with a choice. Lebanon can have an Iranian occupation in Lebanon through Hezbollah, or it can have liberation from Iran and Hezbollah and freedom to Lebanon. The choice is in the hands of the people of Lebanon. The people of Lebanon need to decide their future, and I hope they choose a future where there is not an Iranian-sponsored militia inside Lebanon that does not take orders from the Lebanese government and that this militia, Hezbollah, can decide to start wars whenever it wants, as it did on October 8th, 2023, one day after the October 7th massacre. Where we stand right now is that Hezbollah must disarm. This is what the ceasefire requires. This is what international law requires. This is what UN Security Council resolutions require. Hezbollah must disarm. Hezbollah has not disarmed. The Lebanese government has not disarmed it. And as long as Hezbollah remains armed, that's a violation of the ceasefire. And Israel is not going to wait for someone else to enforce these violations. And that's why you're seeing Israeli activity in Lebanon still almost every day.
Thank you. Our next question comes from X. Do we know what's going on with the Houthis?
Thankfully, it's been a little while since the Houthis in Yemen fired a ballistic missile 2,000 miles to Israel, where I live. This was going on regularly, that this Houthi pirate army in Yemen, which shut down the Red Sea to international shipping out of solidarity with Hamas, was firing ballistic missiles at Israel. The Houthis were in the news recently because just recently, Houthi rebels, this was the first time this happened, they fired surface-to-air missiles at a US F-16 fighter jet. This was on February 19th. The Houthis fired surface-to-air missiles at a US F-16 fighter jet. That jet was flying off the coast of Yemen over the Red Sea when that surface-to-air missile was fired. Thankfully, the missile did not strike the jet. The Houthis also fired another surface-to-air missile at an American MQ-9 Reaper drone that the US was flying over Yemen outside Houthi-controlled areas. Again, this is the first time that the Houthis have fired a surface-to-air missile at an American F-16 fighter jet. I would call that a pretty significant escalation. The Houthis remain a powerful pirate militia in Yemen that, if it chooses to do so, can launch more ballistic missiles, not just in the direction of Israel, but in other countries. It can send drones to Israel, and it can cut off international shipping in the Red Sea, as it did after the October 7th massacre, out of solidarity with Hamas. So we should not forget that the Houthis are still in power in Yemen, and what's going on in the Red Sea should not be ignored.
Thank you, DPR. Our next question comes from Instagram. Why does Gaza seem to hold the upper hand on the hostage deal, especially when Israel has eliminated most of the snakeheads at the top?
The hostage crisis remains a difficult situation to deal with. Hamas is holding these Israeli hostages in closely guarded underground tunnels, where if anyone attempts to rescue them, the hostages could be killed. This gives Hamas an enormous amount of leverage, because Israel wants to see its hostages come home. It's a very difficult war. It's a war that changed our calculations. Whereas before October 7th, Israel may have been trying to buy quiet and keep the situation in Gaza from boiling over. It all changed on October 7th, and now our position is quite clear that Hamas must be removed as the government of Gaza, and Hamas can never be the government of Gaza again, and it can't have a military. But to achieve this objective while Hamas is holding hostages is very difficult. And to pay an enormous ransom to Hamas in exchange for these hostages could mean that Hamas achieves its objective and remains the government of Gaza while seeing hundreds of terrorists released. It is a complicated and delicate situation, which is why we say constantly that we need more pressure on Hamas and more pressure on Hamas's patrons, countries like Iran, Turkey, Qatar, South Africa. Hamas needs to feel like it's isolated if it's going to come down from the tree and accept some kind of settlement, which might see the deportation of senior officials to other countries like Qatar and Turkey in exchange for ending the war and allowing the people of the region to move on. But in the meantime, it's wait and see. We have to find out what's going to happen with phase 2 of this hostage ransom deal. In the meantime, 69 hostages remain in Gaza, and we want to see them home.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Ed on YouTube. What do we know so far about the conditions of the hostages who were released in this deal? And do we know anything about the next phase to come?
The reports about the hostages who were recently released are quite disturbing. It is clear that the hostages in Hamas captivity were tortured, starved, chained, in some cases didn't see the sunlight for more than 500 days. Hamas was holding 2 Israeli hostages for a decade. 2 of them were returned on Saturday. Clearly, they are going to need intense psychological treatment. They were already mentally ill when they entered Gaza on their own, and Hamas held them for a decade. We also have heard stories of hostages who were held in private family homes and used as house slaves. This is how hostages are being treated in Gaza. They are slaves. They are being tortured, starved, and chained. As far as what's to come, we have very little information about the well-being of the hostages who remain in Gaza because Hamas refuses to release such information. But we did see something quite horrific on Saturday, which is that Hamas brought 2 Israeli hostages in a van to the ceremony where they humiliate and torture the hostages who are about to be released. Hamas took 2 Israeli hostages who were not going to be released, but they brought them to the ceremony, made them watch, and made them beg on camera for the hostage ransom payments to continue so that these 2 Israelis could come home. This is what Hamas is doing. Hamas is trying to escalate the pressure on us. Its backers, Qatar and Turkey, don't say a word about this. That's why we need more pressure on Hamas's backers so that Hamas will get the message that this torture of the hostages in its possession must end.
Thank you. This is our final question from Instagram. Now that we've seen the depths of the evil of this terrorist ideology, should Israel be changing its approach to fight this terror?
The short answer is yes, of course, Israel should be changing its approach, and that's part of what we're witnessing. But we have never, I think, in the history of humanity, seen a challenge like this, where an enemy that wants to annihilate us, that wants to kill us all, that wants to wipe Israel off the map, invaded a border, a very short distance, to Israeli homes, massacred 1,200 people, and took hostages back into Gaza. And these are the hostages that it's using to defend itself against a reprisal from the Israeli military. So the hostages are Hamas's insurance and human shields. And it has been a very difficult military operation with 2 goals in mind: removing the threat of Hamas and ensuring the safe return of the hostages. These are 2 objectives that are difficult to achieve at the same time, which is why it's critical that we need the whole world to speak with a clear voice and send a message to Hamas and Hamas's backers and countries like Egypt and Jordan that we're not going back to the past, that we need a new approach that sees a new government in Gaza that will make peace with Israel, and not a government that teaches its people to pursue a forever war against Israel. That's the change that we need. Thank you all for watching this live daily briefing of the Israeli Citizen Spokesperson's Office. I'm Daniel Rubenstein. Have a lovely day.